By April 1850, Napoleon Bonaparte, having escaped from exile on the island of Elba, was once again Emperor of France. But this time, the Seventh Allied Coalition was in no mood to play nice. They declared Bonaparte an outlaw and began assembling a massive force to destroy his dynasty once and for all. In this video, we'll fly through the key moves of that campaign, known as the 100 Days, and focus on perhaps the defining fight of the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo. In fairness, when Bonaparte returned to power, he knew he was facing an enormous task. With Austria, Russia, Britain, Prussia, Spain and Portugal arrayed against him personally, literally declaring war on the man, not the country, he had to act, before more than 750,000 men descended from all directions, crushing him decisively. Let's look at the situation in early June 1815. Napoleon's here, based in Paris, with around 198,000 troops at his disposal, but of that number, more than 60,000 were dispersed in garrisons around France, leaving him with perhaps 130,000 men to stem the oncoming tide. At the same time, the Austrians, Russians, Spanish and Portuguese all assembled to launch their own invasions, with the date agreed for the 1st of July. But for now, they were just a distant risk. The major danger lay here, with the Prussian army of the Lower Rhine under Feldmarschall Gebhard von Blücher and an Anglo-Dutch army under Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Combined, these forces outnumbered Napoleon in an open battle would likely overwhelm him, and certainly, if he did nothing, by July he had no hope of survival. So, as he saw it, his best option was to advance, split the Prussians and Anglo-Dutch, destroy them in turn, and then hope for a negotiated peace with the remaining coalition powers. But who would actually do that fighting? Napoleon's Armée du Nord was a formidable force, with a mixture of old veterans of the Grande Armée and a scattering of conscripts and militia. The main backbone of his army, though, was the Imperial Guard, elite veteran soldiers. They were the shock force that he had used to turn the tide in many a battle. In addition, Napoleon, a former artilleryman, had amassed 366 guns, including his grand battery of 12-pounder Belle Fille, beautiful daughters. Then cavalry. Napoleon had a lot, 22,000, and it was good. Under the command of Marshal Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, it was well-trained and highly mobile and included the famed cuirassiers, breastplated heavy horsemen with a fearsome reputation. Opposing them on the Prussian side were 4 corps of largely militia and conscript infantry, but they were led by some of history's most talented soldiers, including Generals Albus von Gneisenau and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. They also had considerable cavalry support and 214 guns. Then there was the Anglo-Dutch, commanded by the Duke of Wellington. They were something of an unknown force. With a backbone of veteran British battalions who had served in the Peninsular War, they were supplemented by Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, Brunswick and Nassau battalions, including a number of units who just a year earlier had marched in Napoleon's ranks. Wellington's cavalry contingent, under the Earl of Uxbridge, numbered around 15,000, though compared to Bonaparte, he was heavily outgunned with just 156 cannon. Both Wellington and Blücher knew Napoleon was in the area north of Paris and likely to make a strike, but neither knew where or when. Let's look at it from Bonaparte's perspective. First and foremost, he absolutely had to split the Prussians and Anglo-Dutch. Napoleon knew that when threatened, the British and Prussians would naturally move to protect their supply lines, that's to say, west and east respectively, which left an admittedly high-risk opportunity to drive straight up the middle, force both away from each other, thus allowing first the Prussians and then the Anglo-Dutch to be defeated in turn. It's also worth considering that both Allied armies were widely dispersed, and for good reason. Napoleonic period armies simply couldn't stay concentrated in a small area for long. Their men and horses consumed fodder and food at an incredible rate, and soon stripped the land bare, and billeting was limited. So Wellington's army was spread out here, north of the Franco-Belgian border, across a huge area west of the Charleroi-Brussels road, with the Prussians similarly dispersed out to the east of the road. Because of that, and in order to move to support one another, all the major roads in the region had to be held, and the key, perhaps of the entire campaign, was right here, at Quatre Bras. Literally meaning 4 arms, Quatre Bras was the crossroads of the north-south Brussels to Charleroi road, and more importantly the east-west axis between the Anglo-Dutch and the Prussians. Cut that road and the link between the two armies was broken. Unsurprisingly, Napoleon realized this too. And so, at dawn on the 15th of June 1815, Bonaparte made his move. Brushing aside Prussian outposts on the border, his army passed Charleroi, advancing on two fronts. The left wing under Marshal Ney headed directly for Quatre Bras to cut the Allied link road, whilst the bulk under Marshal Grouchy, but with Napoleon himself alongside, headed for Ligny to crush the hastily assembling Prussians. The campaign had begun. The importance of that move was not lost on the Allies, who by the afternoon received the first reports of French movement at the border, but in the age of force of messenger, it took time. In Brussels, where Wellington and his staff were attending a ball hosted by the Duchess of Richmond, confirmation arrived shortly before midnight that the French were advancing, prompting Wellington to famously say, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He's gained 24 hours' march on me." He was right. Sending officers directly from the ball to rejoin their regiments, many still in their finest uniforms, the armies scrambled to concentrate here at Nivelles to react to unfolding events. By nightfall, Napoleon had reached about here, the town of Fleurus, where the following morning he ascended this mill to overlook the battlefield of Ligny. Believing that Marshal Ney should by now have captured Quatre Bras and secured his left flank, he began an attack on a Prussian army of 84,000 men. In a brutal slugfest around the villages of Saint-Amand and Ligny, the French drove the Prussians back, only to be repeatedly counterattacked. All day it went on, until finally Napoleon's committal, the Imperial Guard, broke the Prussian lines around the bridge at Ligny and threatened to destroy the entire Prussian army. In a desperate attempt to save the day, Blucher himself, at 72 years old, led a cavalry countercharge which checked the French advance for some time, though the field marshal was unhorsed, trampled by his own cavalry, and very nearly captured. Battered and bruised, he spent that night in a bath of rhubarb and liniment. The Prussians had been beaten, but crucially not destroyed. The big question now was, what would they do? They had two options. The obvious one, turn east and back towards home, or head north along minor roads to stay within range of the Anglo-Dutch. Gneisenau, who had taken control of the army for the time being, chose the latter, leaving open the possibility of mutual support. For Napoleon, the day had been a great victory, the last of his career as it turned out, with over 16,000 casualties inflicted on the Prussians. Believing them to be utterly defeated, he detached one of his corps, 30,000 men under Marshal Grouchy, with orders to pursue the fleeing Prussians back towards the Rhine, whilst he turned the remainder of his army towards the Anglo-Dutch, who surely by now would be retreating northwards, having lost the crossroads at Quatre Bras. Well, no. It turns out that Quatre Bras had been a complete disaster for the French. Despite arriving in plenty of time and with plenty of men, Marshal Ney, for reasons still debated to this day, had hesitated, delaying his attack far too long against a small Dutch force. And by the time he did begin his assault that afternoon, Wellington had rushed more troops to the area. The result was a hard-fought battle, with each side desperately throwing in reserves to counter their opponent's moves. The wood at Bossuet, which once stood here but no longer exists, saw brutal tree-to-tree fighting for hours, as did the farm complex at Gemiancourt, which changed hands multiple times at the cost of hundreds of lives. Despite several heavy cavalry charges, the crossroads never fell, and disaster was narrowly averted. To get an idea of the calamity of Quatre Bras, we need only look at one French corps, the Comte d'Erlance. Advancing between Napoleon and Ney, D'Ernon's 20,000 men were basically unopposed throughout the day. Ordered by Ney in the early afternoon to attack the Anglo-Dutch left at Quatre Bras, they surely would have turned the tide, except just before getting there, a message from Napoleon arrived saying he was needed 7 miles away to attack the Prussian right at Ligny. Turning around, he marched all the way there, until finally, within sight, he received another furious message from Ney asking where the hell he was, and ordering him to turn immediately to Quatre Bras. So, he turned around again, marched another half-dozen miles, turned up too late, and basically wasted the entire day marching back and forth, when attacking either the Prussians or the Anglo-Dutch would have likely been decisive. By the end of that day, the heavens opened and a massive summer rainstorm soaked everyone, turning the roads to mud. Wellington, learning the Prussians had been beaten, but now knowing they were withdrawing north, not east, did likewise, making his way to the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, just south of the little town of Waterloo. There they passed a miserable night as men shuffled into line to make their stand the following day. Meanwhile, Bonaparte, unwell from a stomach complaint, but content that Grouchy's corps were driving the Prussians eastwards, followed Wellington and prepared to attack. That night, after having met with his leading commanders and probably sharing a few choice words with both D'Erlon and Ney, he set out his plan for the morning. In short, it was this: launch diversionary attacks on Wellington's right, threatening to outflank him and roll up his line, whilst all the time softening up his centre with a massive artillery bombardment, then send his infantry to smash open the Allied line and unleash his cavalry to complete the rout. Simple. Well, not quite. Let's switch over to the drone to look at the Duke's position from the direction the French would come. He'd actually been here at least twice before and had chosen this ground for a reason. First, there was a gentle rise running along the length of his position. His troops, by the way, were placed roughly along the line of this pathway on top of the ridge. Partway along the ridge today is the massive Lion's Mound Memorial, which Wellington hated, by the way. As we keep turning eastwards and tracing Wellington's line along the road, we see that the major advantage it offered was a slightly elevated fighting position for his troops, but also the reverse slope could be used to conceal and shelter his forces from enemy fire. About midway along his line, the main Brussels high road runs north-south, which formed roughly the Duke's centre, with its left wing following this road for about a mile in a distance. By pausing on this shot, we get an idea of the real strength of this ground, though, which came in the form of three major defensible positions standing forward of the main line, acting like breakwaters for any attack. On his far left and seen here in the distance was the farm complex of Papillotte. With solid stone structures and closest to where the Prussians should arrive, it was a key location to break up any French advances in this area. In the centre, to the west of the main Brussels road, was this smaller farm of La Haye-Sainte, with an area known as the Sandpit protecting its eastern entrance. Garrisoning La Haye-Sainte, Wellington placed troops of the highly regarded King's German Legion, and despite, perhaps unwisely, burning the main barn doors for firewood, they would hold to the last man and last round. Then, returning to the satellite image, looking farther over to the Duke's right flank, was this, the Hougoumont farm complex. Much bigger then than today, we can see from this overlaid map of the time that it consisted not only of existing farm buildings around two courtyards, but also had a large wood to its south, a long stone-walled formal garden to the east, orchards and a kitchen garden to its west. Here Wellington would place light troops from his Guards battalions, as well as Hanoverians and Nassau infantry. It was here along these formidable defensive positions that the Duke would make its stand. So, with the scene set about 11:30 a.m. on the morning of the 18th of June, having delayed his attack by several hours to let the ground dry out so that cannibals could graze or bounce, increasing their lethality, the first of Napoleon's guns opened up, signalling the start of the battle. The 1st Infantry move followed shortly after, with men of General Rey's 2nd Corps advancing to clear the wood in front of Hougoumont. After a brutal fight, they drove the Nassaus and Hanoverians back into the farm and lodged their assault. Wave after wave of men now crashed against the walls of Hougoumont, with hundreds falling as the defenders poured musketry at point-blank range, with this area, a cleared strip of 30 or so meters depth, becoming known as the killing ground. Throughout the day, the fight will continue at Hougoumont, with Generals Foy and Jerome Bonaparte throwing more and more men at the farm, the irony being that Napoleon's plan here was to force the Duke to weaken his centre to defend it. In fact, the French ended up throwing far more men into this diversion than Wellington did. By about 2 p.m., with Allied casualties mounting from heavy cannon fire, Napoleon lodged his infantry, this time D'Erlon's unblooded corps, in 4 columns directly at Wellington's centre left. Advancing through crops up to 6 feet high and beyond the hedge blocking the approach, they were hard to see at first. Though before long the Duke's guns were slamming round shot through their dense columns of infantry, sometimes killing a dozen men with a single strike. Still they came on, until finally reaching this position, where they were met by General Picton's infantry. At just 50 yards range, the opposing forces fired round after round into each other, with hundreds falling. But the French weight of numbers was starting to tell as the hard-pressed redcoat battalions edged backwards. Then the Union Brigade struck. Led by Sir William Ponsonby, 3 regiments of heavy horse, perhaps 1,000 men, slammed directly into the oncoming columns and in just a few minutes sent them reeling back from the ridge, having taken thousands of casualties and lost 2 Imperial Eagles. The action being famed in Lady Butler's painting, The Charge of the Scots Greys. Whilst it's true that a number of cavalrymen with their blood up rode on too far, reaching the gun line of Napoleon's Grand Battery, only to be countercharged and badly cut up by fresh French horsemen, the result of their intervention, though, was worthwhile, and d'Erlon's attack had been defeated. By about 4 p.m., as the battle continued to rage around Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, the French began to redeploy much of their heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers moving to the west side of the Brussels road as the cannonade intensified. Wellington, seeing his casualties mounting from artillery, now gave the order for his men to retire a short way to the reverse slope of the ridge and lie down. Seeing this, Ney, possibly still smarting from his failure to take Quatre Bras, saw an opportunity. Believing the British to be retreating, he called for General Milhaud's 4,500-strong cavalry force and led them across this field to break the withdrawing British. First in the walk, then the trot, then the canter, and finally at the gallop, his leading squadrons approached the bridge to be blasted by British canister shot before the gunners fled for cover. Moments later, the leading cavalry crested the ridge and, to their horror, found not fleeing British troops, but infantry formed in hollow defensive squares, silently waiting. Arrayed in 4 ranks covering about 30 by 30 meters, with bayonets bristling in all directions, a horse would simply refuse to charge a square, instead veering away by instinct. And as horsemen threaded their way through the checkerboard pattern, looking for opportunities, they were blasted into oblivion. Retiring momentarily beyond the ridge crest to reform, the French guns opened up again, this time with much better targets. Men grouped in close-packed infantry squares, and the damage done was horrific, with one single round shot striking along the face of a square, killing 18 men in an instant. Again and again the French cavalry returned, with more reserves joining the fray, but each time the squares stood firm and the French withdrew with heavy losses. Some say as many as 15 charges were made across this ground, which after almost 2 hours fighting was thick with dead and dying horses and men, but the squares still stood. As Napoleon's exhausted cavalry limped back to their lines, away to his right, for some time now, there had been major developments, with movement seen in the Bois de Pavie as early as 2 p.m. But who was it? There were 2 possibilities. One, it was Grouchy's 30,000 men, who, having seen off the Prussians, were marching on Wellington's flank. Or 2, it was the Prussians themselves. It turns out, though it wouldn't be clear for some time, it was the Prussians. Having followed what he believed to be the retreating stragglers of the Prussian army eastwards the day before, Grouchy had actually followed a much smaller group of genuine deserting troops, whereas the main Prussian body had moved northwards, effectively wrong-footing him. On the 18th, Grouchy would become entangled with the Prussian rearguard around Wavre, while, albeit slowly, General Ziethen's First Corps and the unblooded Fourth Corps under General von Bülow approached Napoleon's right flank around Plancenoit. Knowing that if Plancenoit fell, he would be trapped, Napoleon deployed his young guard into the village in a desperate bid to hold off von Bülow's massively superior force. Back in the Anglo-Dutch centre, though, things were looking bad. The defenders of La Haye-Sainte, already engaged for hours, were by now perilously short of Baker rifle ammunition, and the repeated French attacks finally won out, with only a handful of the original 450 defenders managing to reach friendly lines as the burning farmhouse fell to the enemy. The French now had a position from which to bring up cannon and hit the British squares from much shorter range, with the 27th Inniskillings losing 68% of their men, who famously died in square. Despite the success, by 7 p.m. Napoleon knew he was in trouble. To his front right, a fierce scrap for the position of Papelotte had been ongoing for hours, but it was now clear that the Prussians were arriving in ever larger numbers, and the young guard, holding his right flank around Plancenoit against massive odds, were beginning to give ground. Throwing 2 battalions of the Old Guard into Plancenoit, the veterans drove the Prussians from the main street, buying enough time for one final gamble. As usual, Napoleon turned to his Imperial Guard. Having hammered Wellington's vulnerable squares with artillery for the last hour, he called forward the remainder of the Middle and Old Guard to break the Anglo-Dutch for good. To the drumbeat of the pas de charge and the thump of cannon, 10 battalions of the Guard in 3 staggered columns, swollen by cavalry and remaining infantry on the flanks, now began their march towards Wellington's perilously weak centre. To everyone it was clear that the decisive moment had arrived. Now the remaining British guns opened up, slamming round shot through the ranks of the approaching columns, which approached on a broad front this time, making it a much more even fight. Right here, the first column met the British Guards. With Wellington watching on as the French came closer, he at last called to their commander, "Now, Maitland, now is your time." In one motion, the Guards rose and unleashed a lethal fire, with each man loosing 3 rounds every minute into the tightly packed enemy. After a short but bloody fight, half of the attackers lay dead or dying, and the survivors withdrew in disarray. Moments later, the second column, off to the right, hit the line, and immediately the troops to their front began to give way. In a desperate fight, Dutch General Chasse rose to the fore. With his last 6 cannon blasting massive holes into the French ranks, and every last Dutchman he could find loading and firing at top speed, the grenadiers of the Guard were finally checked and then driven back under a withering fire. One more column to go. That last effort, advancing just to the left of where the first had struck, flanked the remaining infantry as they moved in one mass onto the disorganized Guards who had just repelled the first attack at heavy cost. Falling into line at top speed, they began firing again, with musket butts slamming into bruised shoulders as the Guard kept coming. Seeing that the fragile line to their front was in massive danger and beginning to frighten men, Colonel John Colborne's voice rang out across the battlefield, ordering his veterans of the 52nd Foot to wheel left. Like a swinging door, his battalion closed in on the left flank of the French column, already hit hard from the front. The 52nd in short succession unleashed a series of crashing volleys at point-blank range into the side of the Guard column. Then at the order, fixed bayonets and charged. The Imperial Guard, the men with whom Napoleon had conquered much of Europe, could take no more and fled back down the slope to the cry of "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats. Napoleon's last gamble had failed. Understanding the importance of the moment, the Duke of Wellington simply raised his hat from his head, signaling the general advance, and the Battle of Waterloo was won. Over the next hours, the victorious Allies swept across the battlefield, clearing the last defenders before finally the halt was ordered and the utterly exhausted troops could draw breath. There was carnage as far as the eye could see, and the cost had been horrendous. All told, Wellington's forces had suffered 17,000 casualties that day, killed, wounded, or missing, with Blucher's Prussians losing a further 6,600. French losses numbered perhaps 26,000, along with 220 guns and a further 15,000 men taken prisoner. Summing up the feelings of many, Wellington would later write, "I don't know what it is to lose a battle, but certainly nothing could be more painful than to gain one with the loss of so many of one's friends." Legend has it that he and Blucher met outside an inn shortly after dusk, La Belle Alliance, the Beautiful Alliance, and whether precisely here or not, it's a fitting name, one which reminds us that the Battle of Waterloo, which ultimately ended one of the bloodiest periods in European history, was truly an Allied victory. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, want to check out our other content right here, including our recent 3D reconstruction and deep dive into the fight for Hougoumont. And if you enjoy content like this, want to check out our Patreon, where you can find full-length virtual tours available exclusively for members, covering many famous actions from the Napoleonic Wars. That's all this time. See you again soon.